HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Beauty of Living, E. Cummings in the Great War, by J. Alison Rosenblitt, read by David Colacci. Labor is blossoming or dancing where the body is not bruised to pleasure soul, nor beauty born out of its own despair, nor blear-eyed wisdom out of midnight oil. O chestnut tree, great-rooted blossomer, are you the leaf, the blossom, or the bowl? O body swayed to music, O brightening glance, how can we know the dancer from the dance? W. B. Yeats, Among School Children. When you and I consult these hearts and minds of ours, what do we learn? That there actually exists a deeper beauty even than the beauty of death. The beauty of living. E. Cummings, Armistice. Prologue. Only my door closing. It was with a genuine and never-to-be-forgotten thrill that I remarked, as I crossed what might have been the threshold, "Mais, on est bien ici." But this is fine. A hideous crash nipped the last word. I had supposed the whole prison to have been utterly destroyed by earthquake, but it was only my door closing. E. Cummings, The Enormous Room. E. Cummings was imprisoned for 2 nights at Noyon, a cathedral town in northeast France, in the cell that was fine. It was, said Cummings, about 16 feet short and 4 feet narrow, with straw at one end and an imposing latrine pail at the other. He had by now tumbled to the notion that his arrest was connected to letters written by his friend William Slater Brown. But he had no idea where he was going, and only a vague idea why. "I am sorry for you," his interrogator had pronounced, "but due to your friend you will be detained a little while." "Several weeks?" asked Cummings. "Possibly." Or possibly longer. He was soon to find that the efforts of fellow prisoners to contact the outside world had a way of going missing. From Noyon he was transferred to a brutal French prison camp in the town of Ferte-Mace. There he faced malnutrition and disease, dangerous levels of damp and cold, and the threat of transfer to the even more brutal prison at Présigny, where many prisoners died. Life at La Ferte-Mace was a test of mental and physical endurance. Lunch, bread and a few scraps of potato in broth, was the soup. Dinner, bread and a few scraps of potato in broth, was imaginatively also the soup. There was an indigestible piece of meat at lunch 3 times a week. The meal call, says Cummings, turned the prisoners into animals. A ferocious and uncouth miracle, this beautiful manifestation of the sinister alchemy of hunger. It was 1917. Cummings had been serving as a volunteer in the Great War, as a driver with a mixed American-French ambulance unit. It was the fashionable thing to do, and among his friends from Harvard, he was far from alone in volunteering. They were young men, and they dreamed of adventure. It was on the Touraine, which sailed from New York on April 28, 1917, that Cummings met Brown. Cummings was a Harvard man, Brown a student at Columbia, and they became instant and intimate friends. The journey continued from ship to train. They were lost in private conversation when the rest of their detachment were herded out by a precipitate fellow volunteer, 1 stop before the last Parisian gare. At the next stop they found themselves alone. They reported to the ambulance service headquarters in Paris, but through the accident of registering 1 day later than the rest of their cohort, their paperwork and requisitioning forms were separated. The requisition forms for their uniforms were processed on a delay. Without uniforms they could not be deployed, And thus, for no reason other than accident of bureaucracy, it was more than a month before deployment to the front caught up with the pair of them. They, meanwhile, enjoyed 5 weeks of freedom in Paris, where they immersed themselves in the Parisian demi-monde. Here Cummings met and dated the Parisian prostitute Marie-Louise Lallemand, the unconventional muse of some of his best war poetry. Cummings's interrogator found this month in Paris most suspicious, and was inclined to press the point. "What did you do in Paris?" "We had a good time." In the demi-monde of Paris, and eventually posted on the French front to Section Sanitaire 21 of the Norton-Arges Ambulance Corps, Cummings began to see the world. He saw more of the world than he could freely write about. He tried repeatedly to communicate with his mother. "In this, my 4th letter to you since arriving on French soil, or my 5th, including the steamer one, I am at a loss to know what to say, inasmuch as Monsieur le Censeur has seen fit to withhold my past effusions, to judge by your last letter which I got yesterday. I shall accordingly do my best to say nothing at all, trusting that you will understand, given the above circumstances, that any other course would prove futile." Cummings was a romantic. His letters, poetry, and prose from Paris and the front report regularly on the glow of twilight and the state of the moon. But he also had a certain sound good sense. Brown was his foil. A likable and intense young man, Brown was also nervous, rash, even hot-headed. He felt the same frustrations at the activities of Monsieur le Censeur, but he responded rather differently. From their miserable, muddy posting under an uptight commanding officer, shifting camps around the département of the Aisne and the Somme, he wrote frank letters home about the atrocities of war, the demoralization of the French troops, and the spread of venereal disease in the American army. Cummings knew nothing of these letters that caused the French authorities to descend upon the pair. The same authorities had no concrete evidence against Cummings, but they were determined to hold Brown. This is as much as Cummings gathered piecemeal from the interrogation to which he was subjected on an otherwise entirely baffling day, as it dawned on him that the questions posed by his interrogators centered on letters written by Brown and seized by the French military censors. With only this muddy sense of the cause of their arrest, and no idea at all of their future, his one concern was loyalty to his friend. He had no wish to allow the French authorities to separate their fates. "Est-ce que vous détestez les Boches? Do you hate the Germans?" was the final question posed by his interrogator. It was, as Cummings describes it, a last and desperate attempt to incriminate him. Cummings was certain of his ground. "I had won my own case. The question was purely perfunctory. To walk out of the room a free man, I had merely to say yes." At this decisive moment in his life, we meet Edward Estlin Cummings. He is perhaps naive. He has not grasped a fraction of what is in store. He has seen the realities of the front, but he has not lost his taste for adventure. He is determined, quick-witted. Above all, he is loyal to his friends. He took a dive. Does he not hate the Germans? Deliberately I framed my answer. Non, j'aime beaucoup les Français. No, I love very much the French. And thus his imprisonment began. Part 1. Cambridge, 1894 through 1911. 1. Beyond the River. E. Cummings grew up in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in a house about 8 minutes' walk from Harvard Yard. His neighbors were Harvard professors, and his childhood was spent in the shadow of the university. His high school, the Cambridge Latin School, sat at the end of his road, and the tops of the grand Harvard buildings are visible from its grounds. Cummings's childhood home still stands today at 104 Irving Street. It is the only house in the area with an 8-foot-high picket fence and a tight, unfriendly ring of evergreen trees, suggesting that its present owners have endured their fill of curious tourists. Cambridge, Massachusetts, is scattered gently along one bank of the Charles River. It bleeds at the edges into its scurrilous twin, Somerville, where, says Cummings, they throw snowballs packed round rocks. Maybe they always pack their snowballs around rocks, but it is hard to escape the suspicion that any Somerville child could spot any Cambridge child from a snowball's distance. In the 1970s and 1980s, Somerville fell into the orbit of the Boston Mafia, the Winter Hill Gang, and James Whitey Bulger. Today it is where Harvard graduate students live when they cannot afford Cambridge rents. The river itself runs low and flat. It has a dead blue-gray sheen. It feels fathomless. The line it draws between Cambridge and Somerville together on one bank and Boston on the other is not a line between city and suburb. It divides two worlds, so that from either bank the other is unreal. In the mind of another Boston poet, Robert Lowell, scion of a conspicuous Boston family that boasted poets and Harvard presidents aplenty, the Charles doubled as the river Styx, with the ancient ferryman Charon presiding, to shepherd souls across to the underworld. On the rigid Charles in snow, Charon the lubber clambers from his wherry. Boston is a port, indelibly written into history for the Boston Tea Party. At the turn of the 20th century, it was the 5th largest city in America, population 560,892. But Cambridge held the university. Power lay on both sides of the river. Cummings was his parents' first child, born on the 14th of October, 1894, and named Edward Estlin. Edward after his father, and Estlin after the English Unitarian theologian and friend of his father, Joseph Estlin Carpenter. He was born into an age of transition. Horse and carriage were the norm, or horse and sleigh in winter, and motor cars, although not unknown, still seemed a pretentious folly. Cummings's parents acquired an Orient buckboard, a car that puttered like a dying lawnmower, and that looks less like a car than like a four-wheeled wheelbarrow, barely scaled up to fit human passengers. The Orient claimed to reach the dizzying speed of 30 miles per hour, although Cummings's younger sister, Elizabeth, remembered its speed as closer to 15 miles per hour. It was manufactured by the Waltham Watch Company, so named because they specialized originally in the manufacture of watches, not cars. The wheels ran on chains like a bicycle, and the engine had to be started around the back by pulling on a strap. Elizabeth also remembered that the local boys would run alongside the car shouting, "Why don't you get a horse?" Boston was urban, and yet small enough to find a civic identity through its town hall meetings, many of them graced, one might say, with the presence of Cummings's father, the Reverend Edward Cummings, minister of Boston's South Congregational Church. Cummings's mother adored him. We have, thanks to her, every physical scrap of his childhood enshrined in the Harvard Library archives. She adored him to the point of absurdity. She saved every piece of paper he touched. There is page after page of baby's first scribbles. Any mother might save her child's first effort at pencil to paper, but Rebecca Cummings saved dozens and dozens, sheets with no more than a pencil scratch across the page, or a gashed zigzag. Some have got as far as a wobbly sort of spiral. There is something endearing but faintly ridiculous in the preservation of these aged and fragile sheets in Harvard's plush archival space, for the benefit of the researcher, who turns them ever so carefully, fingertips on the corners of the page. The scribbles give way to the usual obsessions and delights of boyhood. There was a trains phase, a heroes from Homer's Iliad phase, a phase drawing medieval knights in armor. There is Estlin's great animal arena, exploding with animal life. From the style and sheer volume of the drawings, it is obvious that Cummings sketched and painted swiftly, but he stuck to his topics. His animal arena proceeds methodically through ungulates, warthog, babirusa, peccary, domestic hog, wild boar, sirenia, walrus, seal, sea elephant, manatee, sea lion, marsupials, and much, much more, all carefully labeled. The zoological taxonomy is obviously lifted from some encyclopedia or book of animals, but Cummings's boyhood imagination was not limited to rote mimicry. Side by side with the methodical copies are dozens of sketches and watercolors in which the animals are recombined into Estlin's own zoo. He privileged his mother with a forceful black and red ticket. Mrs. Edward E. Cummings, season ticket, Estlin's great animal arena, positively not transferable. If presented by other person than party herein named, ticket will be taken up and not renewed. Direction of Mr. Edward E. Cummings. It would always be like this with Cummings. His work was fed by contradictory energies. It was rapid but focused, instinctive but obsessive. He was known for an urgently spontaneous poetry of is and now, but behind these poems lie methodical drafts upon drafts. A poem might evolve suddenly with a change of a line or even a stanza, and then a dozen retypes altering a word or a single comma. Cummings also documented his own life with meticulous care. In introspective moods, he would type page after page of daily thoughts and feelings and memories. But at the same time that he catalogued, scrutinized, and organized his inner life, he would doodle indiscriminately on every scrap of paper within reach. His pencil marks sprawl over every torn-off envelope flap or back of a canceled check that came to hand. In his notes he pondered the paradox that chaos represented, as he saw it, the essence of life, yet to embody life in art required the imposition of order. He felt that the essential breakthrough of Cézanne was the genius to organize artistic expression without freezing the life out of movement and chaos. Cummings's life and his art were both caught between chaos and control. To all outward appearances, a childhood could hardly have been more progressive. Cummings's father's father held that it was best for children to start school late, and since this had worked out fine for him, the Reverend took the same approach to his own children. He regarded it as unnatural to force a child of 5 or 6 to sit rigidly tied to a desk all day, and both Cummings and Elizabeth started school several years later than their peers. Meanwhile, there was always company in a household made full by parents, aunts, uncles, grandmothers, and servants, and there were so many places to play. The house was huge and rambling. It had secret hideaways, and, Cummings and Elizabeth believed, an even more secret hideaway that they never even saw. This most secret of hiding places lay behind a built-in bookcase on the 3rd floor, and, as far as they understood, it had something to do with honoring the actions of their paternal grandfather, who had offered sanctuary to fugitive slaves on the Underground Railroad. They played in the cellar and the tool room and on the roof, which had a flat portion accessible through a skylight in the loft. In good weather they used the roof to fly a kite that Cummings had made himself. For cold weather they had central heating powered by a furnace in the cellar. But as it was a large and draughty house, they kept wood fires burning in almost every room. The house was connected by a series of speaking tubes built into the walls, linking room to room and even floor to floor. Not all the tubes and buttons worked, wrote Elizabeth later, but some of them did. Elizabeth was Cummings's only sibling, 6.5 years younger than him. They played together throughout their childhood, not only around the house, but also roaming the neighborhood. Cummings carried Elizabeth on the handlebars of his bicycle on rides across Cambridge, collecting stones and turtles. About 100 paces down the street from home, they could escape into a semi-wilderness, known locally after the Harvard eminence Charles Eliot Norton as Norton's Woods. What was once a nickname is now the official moniker. A small portion of the woods remains, supplemented with a conference center and wedding venue. Apart from a smattering of pines, they are deciduous, mostly maple and American oak. Cummings always remembered the thrill of the threshold, guarded by lilacs, before you crossed into the shock of sudden shade and the sunlight filtering through a high tree canopy. The woods had the tang of adventure, heightened by the delicious memory of having been once chased from the lilac bushes by a neighbor's coachman. It was a child-sized wilderness indeed, wild enough to tease the imagination, but safe enough to enjoy the thrill of imagined danger. When you know what to look for in a life, there are always hints of what lies ahead. In his last years before university, at the Cambridge High and Latin School, his marks for English, Latin, Greek, algebra, and Roman history were fair to good, with one excellent result in French. But he failed twice, once poor and once even worse ungraded, in deportment. Cummings's love of French and his scruffy deportment were to play a more pivotal role in his life than his high school teachers could ever have imagined. But his robust childhood prepared Cummings in other ways for events to come. When Cummings was 5 years old, the Reverend purchased a summer home, Joy Farm, near Silver Lake in the mountains of New Hampshire. It was a vast property with a run-down house, outbuildings, enormous grounds, a hayfield, and woodlands, as well as pigs, a goat, hens, cows, and a donkey. It became a fixed axis around which Cummings's life revolved until his death, which occurred at Joy Farm itself in 1962. The property was surrounded by a pine forest, and Cummings and Elizabeth were encouraged to venture as far as they liked, provided only that they carried a compass and a box of matches. The compass was to get them home safely. The matches were an emergency measure. If they were truly lost, they had instructions to build a small fire, safely on a rock so that it would not spread, as a smoke signal so that their father could find and rescue them. The risks were real, bad enough for adults. The Reverend and Rebecca and half the local village spent one night searching for neighbors who had gone missing, lost in the pines, and who finally turned up safe but weak the next day. However, Elizabeth trusted her older brother implicitly. She never mastered her own compass, for she knew that he would always get them both home safely. Cummings felt his sister's trust, and he was protective, tender, and attentive toward her. He was the one to keep an eye on her, as one summer, when the family decided to increase the water supply to Joy Farm by widening the spring-fed water pool from which they pumped water for the house. Drinking water always came from the well for the sake of the taste of the freshly drawn well water, but the Reverend had installed piping and a water tank fed by the pool to meet the other needs of the household. The water pool was rock, and to widen it meant dynamite. They enlisted the local village expert, who rigged up the dynamite in the pool's depth on a long fuse to allow him time to escape. Cummings and Elizabeth and other neighboring children gathered for the event, poised to scarper at the expert's warning shout. Just as he put a match to the fuse, he slipped on a rung of the ladder out of the pool. As he slipped, he shouted, and the sheer terror in his voice caused Elizabeth to freeze. Everyone else ran, and only Cummings noticed that Elizabeth was rooted to the spot. He dashed back, grabbed her, and tugged her into running off together. She, and luckily the village dynamite man, escaped in time. Back home in Cambridge, Cummings and Elizabeth played either together or as part of a neighborhood gang of 10 or 12 of varying ages, more boys than girls. They played makeshift sports, tag, and hide-and-seek. Cummings was a natural leader, and the gang often hung out in his spacious treehouse. They governed themselves by a code. "There were," said Elizabeth, "very few fights or squabbles, as I remember it. Perhaps this was because the older children were there to see that nobody got picked on, and the younger ones were ashamed to behave in a babyish way in front of the older ones. If anybody didn't play fair or made a fuss, he was just left out of our games." A very strong sense of honor and of the nature of fair play prevented this policy from turning into mere conformism. Understanding and not judgment was extended to any action taken in good faith. Once the gang pelted with snowballs a passing adult, who took it unkindly and, turning tables, chased the gang around with a particular desire to ascertain responsibility for the snowball that had clean whizzed off his derby hat. He cornered one of the younger boys, who was terrorized into giving up Cummings as the author of that splendid shot. But no one, says Elizabeth, blamed the boy for ratting. He was utterly terrified and deserved only sympathy. As well as a leader, Cummings was also a natural storyteller and entertainer. When he and Elizabeth came down with whooping cough and were quarantined in a room together for weeks, he cheered her up the whole time by making up stories to keep her spirits up. Afterward he formed a whooper club, for which the entry requirements were, A, to have had the whooping cough, which was rampaging through the neighborhood, and B, to compose a story for the club, so that they could type up a whooper club paper on Rebecca's typewriter. It was considered so desirable a club among the local gang that children who had not yet had the whooping cough endeavored to catch it from infectious playmates in order to join. On the other hand, childhood had its austerities. Rebecca Cummings was a great advocate of the cold bath. She and the children took cold baths every morning in Cambridge, and ice-cold morning showers outdoors at Joy Farm. Perhaps even this played its role later in life. Years of hardening his body in cold showers may have offered some protection against one of the greater dangers of Cummings's imprisonment, the freezing showers imposed on the inmates in the unheated midwinter of a French prison by sadistic guards who regarded their charges as scum, and if they died of pneumonia in prison, then good riddance. Cummings preferred to remember his child as an idol. There were many splendors of company, and of solitude, and of the gorgeousness of the unforbidden forests of Norton's Woods and Joy Farm. When they could, the family traveled up to Joy Farm in May to see the land at its finest. May brought apple blossoms and lilacs, white blossom on the blueberry bushes and wild strawberry, dandelion, buttercup, and muguet, lily of the valley. Irises were in bud and sweet rocket in bloom. Then the irises would open, followed by white daisy and white roses. The wildflowers carpeted the expanse under the trees, while the children also thrilled to the lingering woodland hints of earlier settlement. Cummings and Elizabeth belonged to a generation that had little sense of culpability for the destruction brought to America's indigenous nations by European settlement, and they had none of today's worries about the environmental consequences of deforestation. They took a naive joy in the idea of Silver Lake's first settlers, and in the rotting stumps of the largest, oldest white pines that had been cut down to supply those settlements. Among Joy Farm's proudest features were its floorboards, of a magnificent breadth from the largest trunks, unmatched in newer building. Whether they managed a May visit or not, The family always spent high summer at Joy Farm, and remained through the summertime berries, apples, and the scything.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?